From Alexander to Aurangzeb. Chandragupta. Alexander in India. Chandragupta the Liberator. The people. The University of Taxila. The Royal Palace. A day in the life of a king. An older Machiavelli. Administration. Law. Public health. Transport and roads. Municipal government. In the year 327 BC, Alexander the Great, pushing on from Persia, marched over the Hindu Kush and descended upon India. For a year, he campaigned among the northwestern states that had formed one of the Persian Empire's richest provinces, exacting supplies for his troops and gold for his treasury. Early in 326 BC, he crossed the Indus, fought his way slowly through Taxila and Rawalpindi to the south and east, encountered the army of King Porus, defeated 30,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, 300 chariots, and 200 elephants, and slew 12,000 men. When Porus, having fought to the last, surrendered, Alexander, admiring his courage, stature, and fine features, bade him say what treatment he wished to receive. "Treat me, Alexander," he answered, "in a kingly way." "For my own sake," said Alexander, thou shalt be so treated. For thine own sake do thou demand what is pleasing to thee." But Porus said that everything was included in what he had asked. Alexander was much pleased with this reply. He made Porus king of all conquered India, as a Macedonian tributary, and found him thereafter a faithful and energetic ally. Alexander wished then to advance even to the eastern sea, but his soldiers protested. After much oratory and pouting, he yielded to them, and led them, through patriotically hostile tribes that made his wearied troops fight almost every foot of the way, down the Hydaspes, and up the coast of Gedrosia to Baluchistan. When he arrived at Susa, 20 months after turning back from his conquests, his army was at a miserable fragment of that which had crossed into India with him 3 years before. 7 years later, all trace of Macedonian authority had already disappeared from India. The chief agent of its removal was one of the most romantic figures in Indian history, a lesser warrior but a greater ruler than Alexander. Chandragupta was a young Kshatriyan noble exiled from Magadha by the ruling Nanda family to which he was related. Helped by his subtle Machiavellian advisor, Kautilya Chanakya, the youth organized a small army, overcame the Macedonian garrisons, and declared India free. Then he advanced upon Pataliputra, the modern Patna, capital of the Magadha kingdom, fomented a revolution, seized the throne, and established that Mauryan dynasty which was to rule Hindustan and Afghanistan for 137 years. Subordinating his courage to Kautilya's unscrupulous wisdom, Chandragupta soon made his government the most powerful then existing in the world. When Megasthenes came to Pataliputra as ambassador from Seleucus Nicator, king of Syria, he was amazed to find a civilization which he described to the incredulous Greeks, still near their zenith, as entirely equal to their own. The Greek gave a pleasant, perhaps a lenient, account of Hindu life in his time. It struck him as a favorable contrast with his own nation that there was no slavery in India. "This is a great thing in India," says Aryan, "that all the inhabitants are free, not a single Indian being a slave." It struck him, also, that though the population was divided into castes according to occupations, it accepted these divisions as natural and tolerable. "They live happily enough," the ambassador reported, "being simple in their manners and frugal. They never drink wine except at sacrifice. The simplicity of their laws and their contracts is proved by the fact that they seldom go to law. They have no suits about pledges and deposits, nor do they require either seals or witnesses, but make their deposits and confide in each other. Truth and virtue they hold alike in esteem. The greater part of the soil is under irrigation, and consequently bears 2 crops in the course of a year. It is accordingly affirmed that famine has never visited India, and that there has never been a general scarcity in the supply of nourishing food." The oldest of the 2,000 cities of northern India in Chandragupta's time was Taxila, 20 miles northwest of the modern Rawalpindi. Aryan describes it as a large and prosperous city. Strabo says it is large and has most excellent laws. It was both a military and a university town, strategically situated on the main road to Western Asia, and containing the most famous of the several universities possessed by India at that time. Students flocked to Taxila, as in the Middle Ages they flocked to Paris. There, all the arts and sciences could be studied under eminent professors, and the medical school especially was held in high repute throughout the Oriental world. The excavations of Sir John Marshall on the site of Taxila have unearthed delicately carved stones, highly polished statuary, coins as old as 600 BC, and glassware of a fine quality never bettered in later India. It is manifest, says Vincent Smith, that a high degree of material civilization had been attained, and that all the arts and crafts incident to the life of a wealthy, cultured city were familiar. Megasthenes describes Chandragupta's capital, Pataliputra, as 9 miles in length and almost 2 miles in width. The palace of the king was of timber, but the Greek ambassador ranked it as excelling the royal residences of Susa and Ecbatana, being surpassed only by those at Persepolis. Its pillars were plated with gold, and ornamented with designs of bird life and foliage. Its interior was sumptuously furnished, and adorned with precious metals and stones. There was a certain oriental ostentation in this culture, as in the use of gold vessels 6 feet in diameter. But an English historian concludes, from the testimony of the literary, pictorial, and material remains, that in the 4th and 3rd centuries before Christ, the command of the Maurya monarch over luxuries of all kinds, and skilled craftsmanship in all the manual arts, was not inferior to that enjoyed by the Mughal emperors 18 centuries later. In this palace, Chandragupta, having won the throne by violence, lived for 24 years as in a gilded jail. Occasionally he appeared in public, clad in fine muslin, embroidered with purple and gold, and carried in a gold palanquin or on a gorgeously accoutred elephant. Except when he rode out to the hunt, or otherwise amused himself, he found his time crowded with the business of his growing realm. His days were divided into 16 periods of 90 minutes each. In the first he arose and prepared himself by meditation. In the second he studied the reports of his agents and issued secret instructions. The third he spent with his counselors in the hall of private audience. In the fourth he attended to state finances and natural defense. In the fifth he heard the petitions and suits of his subjects. In the sixth he bathed and dined and read religious literature. In the seventh he received taxes and tribute and made official appointments. In the eighth he again met with his council and heard the reports of his spies, including the courtesans whom he used for this purpose. The ninth he devoted to relaxation and prayer, the 10th and 11th to military matters, the 12th again to secret reports, the 13th to the evening bath and repast, the 14th, 15th, and 16th to sleep. Perhaps the historian tells us what Chandragupta might have been, or how Catalia wished the people to picture him, rather than what he really was. Truth does not often escape from palaces. The actual direction of government was in the hands of the crafty vizier. Kautilya was a Brahmin who knew the political value of religion, but took no moral guidance from it. Like our modern dictators, he believed that every means was justifiable if used in the service of the state. He was unscrupulous and treacherous, but never to his king. He served Chandragupta through exile, defeat, adventure, intrigue, murder, and victory, and by his wily wisdom made the empire of his master the greatest that India had ever known. Like the author of The Prince, Kautilya saw fit to preserve in writing his formulas for warfare and diplomacy. Tradition ascribes to him the Arthashastra, the oldest book in extant Sanskrit literature. As an example of its delicate realism, we may take its list of means for capturing a fort: intrigue, spies, winning over the enemy's people, siege, and assault. A wise economy of physical effort. The government made no pretense to democracy, and was probably the most efficient that India has ever had. Akbar, greatest of the Mughals, had nothing like it, and it may be doubted if any of the ancient Greek cities were better organized. It was based frankly upon military power. Chandragupta, if we may trust Megasthenes, who should be as suspect as any foreign correspondent, kept an army of 600,000 foot, 30,000 horse, 9,000 elephants, and an unnamed number of chariots. The peasantry and the Brahmins were exempt from military service, and Strabo describes the farmers tilling the soil in peace and security in the midst of war. The power of the king was theoretically unlimited, but in practice it was restricted by a council which, sometimes with the king, sometimes in his absence, initiated legislation, regulated national finances and foreign affairs, and appointed all the more important officers of state. Megasthenes testifies to the high character and wisdom of Chandragupta's counselors and to their effective power. The government was organized into departments with well-defined duties and a carefully graded hierarchy of officials, managing respectively revenue, customs, frontiers, passports, communications, excise, mines, agriculture, cattle, commerce, warehouses, navigation, forests, public games, prostitution, and the mint. The superintendent of excise controlled the sale of drugs and intoxicating drinks, restricted the number and location of taverns and the quantity of liquors which they might sell. The superintendent of mines leased mining areas to private persons, who paid a fixed rent and a share of the profits to the government. A similar system applied to agriculture, for all the land was owned by the state. The superintendent of public games supervised the gambling halls, supplied dice, charged a fee for their use, and gathered in for the treasury 5% of all money taken in by the bank. The superintendent of prostitution looked after public women, controlled their charges and expenditures, appropriated their earnings for 2 days of each month, and kept 2 of them in the royal palace for entertainment and intelligence service. Taxes fell upon every profession, occupation, and industry. And in addition, rich men were from time to time persuaded to make benevolences to the king. The government regulated prices and periodically assayed weights and materials. It carried on some manufactures in state factories, sold vegetables, and kept a monopoly of mines, salt, timber, fine fabrics, elephants, and horses. Law was administered in the village by local headmen, or by panchayats, village councils of 5 men. In towns, districts, and provinces by inferior and superior courts. At the capital by the royal council as a supreme court, and by the king as a court of last appeal. Penalties were severe and included mutilation, torture, and death, usually on the principle of lex talionis, or equivalent retaliation. But the government was no mere engine of repression. It attended to sanitation and public health, maintained hospitals and poor relief stations, distributed in famine years the food kept in state warehouses for such emergencies, forced the rich to contribute to the assistance of the destitute, and organized great public works to care for the unemployed in depression years. The Department of Navigation regulated water transport and protected travelers on rivers and seas. It maintained bridges and harbors and provided government ferries in addition to those that were privately managed and owned. An admirable arrangement whereby public competition could check private plunder and private competition could discourage official extravagance. The Department of Communications built and repaired roads throughout the empire, from the narrow wagon tracks of the villagers to trade routes 32 feet and royal roads 64 feet wide. One of these imperial highways extended 1,200 miles from Pataliputra to the northwestern frontier, a distance equal to half the transcontinental spread of the United States. At approximately every mile, says Megasthenes, These roads were marked with pillars indicating directions and distances to various destinations. Shade trees, wells, police stations, and hotels were provided at regular intervals along the route. Transport was by palanquins, chariots, bullock carts, horses, camels, elephants, asses, and men. Elephants were a luxury usually confined to royalty and officialdom, and so highly valued that a woman's virtue was thought a moderate price to pay for one of them. Quote, "Their women, who are very chaste, and would not go astray for any other reason, on the receipt of an elephant have communion with the donor. The Indians do not think it disgraceful to prostitute themselves for an elephant, and to the women it even seems an honor that their beauty should appear equal in value to an elephant." Aryan. The same method of departmental administration was applied to the government of the cities. Pataliputra was ruled by a commission of 30 men divided into 6 groups. One group regulated industry, another supervised scavengers and strangers, assigning to them lodgings and attendance, and watching their movements. Another kept a record of births and deaths. Another licensed merchants, regulated the sale of produce, and tested weights and measures. Another controlled the sale of manufactured articles. Another collected a tax of 10% on all sales. In short, says Havel, Pataliputra in the 4th century BC seems to have been a thoroughly well-organized city. It administered according to the best practices of social science. The perfection of the arrangements thus indicated, says Vincent Smith, is astonishing, even when exhibited in outline. Examination of the departmental details increases our wonder that such an organization could have been planned and efficiently operated in India in 300 BC. The one defect of this government was autocracy, and therefore continual dependence upon force and spies. Like every autocrat, Chandragupta held his power precariously, always fearing revolt and assassination. Every night he used a different bedroom, and always he was surrounded by guards. Hindu tradition, accepted by European historians, tells how, when a long famine came upon his kingdom, Chandragupta, in despair at his helplessness, abdicated his throne, lived for 12 years thereafter as a Jain ascetic, and then starved himself to death. All things considered, said Voltaire, the life of a gondolier is preferable to that of a doge. But I believe the difference is so trifling that it is not worth the trouble of examining.